Texas, 1886. Late summer. The sky was neither blue nor gray, but something in between, like parchment stained by time. Wind moved through the prairie grass in waves, brushing the land with hands that knew loss. A windmill creaked in the distance. Not loud, not urgent, just a tired voice repeating what it always says. Dust hung in the air like memory, fine and quiet, catching the last light before dusk. The barn stood alone. Its boards warped, its roof slouched forward like a man who'd stopped praying. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for the wind to pass through, just enough for the mare inside to see the horizon but not reach it. She paced, hooves thudding in soft rhythm. Not wild, not calm, just waiting. And then there was her. She lay on the dirt floor, wrists bound with rope, ankles swollen. Her dress, once blue, now the color of ash and silence. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not ask. But her presence was not quiet. It radiated something older than the ropes themselves. Something carved in the shape of every woman who had been tied, not just by hands, but by names, by shame, by the weight of being unwanted. She blinked slowly, as if each breath was a decision, not asleep, not awake, between. Her face was streaked with dust, but her eyes were clear, clear like water that hadn't been touched in years, and they held something, not hope, not fear, recognition. He rode past her every day, always the same pace, same path, same silence. A man with a hat pulled low, back straight, coat too long for the season. He didn't stop, not in 7 years, not since the day the earth closed around the woman who called him husband. But that evening the stillness felt different. The wind wasn't just wind, the dust wasn't just dust, and something, he couldn't name what, made him pull the reins. The preacher dismounted slowly, as if testing whether the world would hold still. His boots sank half an inch into the ground, not mud, just softness, the kind that appears when no one has walked a path for too long. He pushed open the barn door. It groaned. She didn't flinch. Her eyes found him and stayed. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't need to. He had seen her face before, in dreams, in pews, in shadows that lingered too long near church steps. Faces of women not broken, but abandoned. Faces that carried their own verdicts. The mare stopped pacing, as if she too had been waiting. He stepped inside, careful not to kick the empty bucket near her head, careful not to make the rope tighten further. He saw the marks on her wrists, raw, red, speaking of more than just physical restraint. He saw the line of her jaw, strong, but locked with something heavier than pride, and in the fading light, he saw her eyes again. This time, they weren't asking for release. They were remembering every time they hadn't been believed. He hadn't spoken a full sentence in months, not since the funeral, not since the final amen that no one stayed to echo. But something about her, not her condition, not her weakness, not her silence, but her certainty. It summoned something in him, a memory of who he used to be before life taught him to whisper. The blade he carried wasn't sharp. He hadn't needed it for anything but bread, but he drew it slow and knelt beside her. She didn't pull away. She watched, steady. And he watched her hands, small, bruised, clenched in defense. He didn't touch her skin, just the rope. The fibers frayed as he worked. The knife made no sound, only his breath did, rough, shallow, breaking the silence that had grown too thick. And then with a final tug, the knot loosened. But what unraveled in that moment was not just rope. It was something inside him, old, dormant, waiting to feel useful again. He hadn't saved a soul in 7 years. He wasn't even sure he still believed in salvation. But as she sat up slowly, not looking at him but not away either, he felt something shift. The rope fell to the floor, limp, irrelevant now. But the burns on her wrists remained, red, raw, symmetrical. He glanced at his own neck, where the sun had burned a cross shape into his skin from years of wearing the same collar, walking the same miles, saying the same sermons to graves instead of people. 2 marks, 2 histories, carried longer than necessary. She didn't thank him. He didn't ask her name. Outside, the mare whinnied once and settled. Inside, the air held steady, and the preacher, for the first time in 7 years, remembered what it felt like to be needed, not by a congregation, not by a cause, but by a human being who had already lost too much. He stood. She stayed seated. No words, just presence. The wind outside paused, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He didn't speak when he entered. Just looked at the knots, then at her hands, then began with the knife. The barn wasn't dark, but dim in a way that made the air feel older than it was. Dust floated like sleep waiting to settle. The preacher's fingers moved slowly, not with hesitation but with reverence, like someone stepping into sacred ground. He had touched death. He had held the hand of his wife as she slipped away without words. But this was different. This was someone still here. The way he moved said more than any name ever could. Quiet steps, even breath. Shoulders low, not from defeat, but from carrying the weight of knowing too much. He didn't ask who tied her, or why. Some answers didn't need asking. Some truths wore themselves into the skin, into the way someone holds their arms, into the way a woman doesn't wince at pain, only at kindness. When the ropes fell away, she didn't move. That stillness, it was louder than any scream. It wasn't fear that kept her still, it was memory. Movement had meant punishment before. Movement had meant being noticed, being named, being owned. He stepped back, not offering a hand, not offering help, just space. She sat up slowly, arms folded across her chest, not for warmth but for armor. Her eyes flicked to the barn door, then to the mare, then back to the man who hadn't asked her anything, who hadn't promised her anything, and maybe that was why she didn't run. He left the knife on the ground near her, not as a gift, not as a threat, just there, as if to say, I see you. You decide what you need now. Outside, the prairie stretched quiet under the falling light. He walked back to his horse, paused, and looked once over his shoulder. She was still watching him, still not pleading, still not grateful, and he understood. Some people feared the law, others feared loneliness. But in these parts, what kept men quiet wasn't fear, it was survival. He had learned that after the war, after the sermons, after burying his wife with no one left to say goodbye but the wind. Silence was what kept you safe, but sometimes silence kills too. He hadn't touched another soul since the day the midwife wrapped his stillborn child in white linen, since the screams had stopped and all that remained was the ticking of the clock on the church wall. That day, something inside him folded, neat and final. He locked it away, called it God's will, and let the world get quiet. But today, with her eyes, with that bruised stillness, with those hands trembling not from pain but from gentleness, something cracked, not loud, not all at once, but real. He made no fire that night, sat on the barn's edge instead, coat pulled over his shoulders, eyes on the sky. He wasn't guarding her, he wasn't protecting anything. He was shielding himself from a guilt he hadn't named, the guilt of waiting too long. The guilt of knowing that someone had been tied up less than a mile from his doorstep and he had passed by without stopping. In the distance, a coyote howled once, then fell silent. She didn't sleep. He could tell by the way the straw shifted. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't crying, just awake, like him. Two strangers sitting in the bones of their own stories. He thought of all the times he'd been told to mind his own business. How silence had kept him alive. How silence had kept others dead. And he wondered, not for the first time, if righteousness had anything to do with being right. The sky darkened, and in that night, nothing was spoken, nothing was fixed, nothing was saved, but something had been cut, something deeper than rope, something inside him that had stayed tied for too long, and he let it remain untied. She didn't leave the barn, not the next day, nor the one after. The door was open. The sun poured in gently. The mare had stopped pacing. The preacher never barred her way, but still, she stayed, as if the ropes had taken part of her legs with them, as if walking now required more than muscle, required permission, and that permission she no longer knew how to give herself. He brought her food, not on a plate, not with ceremony, just a bowl left on a wooden crate near the door, sometimes bread, sometimes stew, sometimes only water, always silent, always within reach, but not too close. The first 3 days, she didn't touch it. Then one afternoon, when the wind was softer and the mare had started chewing hay again, she picked up the bowl with bare hands. She didn't eat fast. She didn't hide, just lifted the spoon and let the warmth settle into her mouth like something long forgotten. He watched from the house through a cracked window, pretending to fix the same drawer he'd fixed the week before. And when she ate, he exhaled, not in relief, not in triumph, just in acknowledgement. That survival has many shapes. That trust can look like broth on a wooden spoon. That night, he laid his coat over his boots and slept on the porch. Not for her, not to stand guard, but because sleeping inside felt too loud now. The silence of the barn had changed him, made the house feel too closed, too warm, too forgiving for a man who had done nothing but cut a rope. His dreams were shallow. A baby crying in an empty cradle, his wife walking away in white, her hair unraveling in the wind. And in the background always the sound of rope tightening. She didn't look at him when she passed by to fetch water the next morning. Her steps were uneven. Her dress still clung to her like an accusation, but her shoulders were less curled, her breath less shallow. She didn't thank him. He didn't speak. The quiet between them had changed again, from hesitation to coexistence. The preacher noticed something he hadn't felt in years: hesitation, not in her, in himself. When to speak, whether to approach, if kindness could be its own form of trespass. His sermons had once filled rooms. Now he struggled to meet a woman's eyes without feeling like he was breaking something sacred. And still, the rain didn't come. The air was heavy, like the sky was waiting. The clouds passed with threats but never followed through. Crops curled, wells whispered of dryness. But that barn, that woman, held its own weather. Inside her, something was moving, slowly, silently, like water beneath cracked earth. One evening, as he lit a single lamp on the porch, he saw her watching him, not hiding, not staring, just there. She stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed, hair loose, eyes not afraid, not inviting, just present. And for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people who didn't know what to do with gentleness. Two people who had been untouched for too long. She didn't smile. He didn't nod. But something passed between them. Not the past, not a promise, just recognition. That night, when he slept again outside, the wind picked up slightly. Not enough to call a storm, just enough to move the curtains. And though the sky withheld the rain, he knew it had already fallen, just not where people could see. It began with smoke, not thick, not rising in alarm, just a thread of grey, curling through the slats of the barn, like a question no one wanted to answer. The preacher saw it as he returned from the well, bucket in hand, sun low behind him. For a breath he froze, then the bucket dropped. He ran. His boots pounded the earth, stirring dust as he crossed the yard. The barn door was ajar, same as always. The mare neighed once, restless. Inside, a blanket smoldered, flames licking the edge of straw. Not roaring, not wild, but alive enough to mean danger. She stood near the back wall, motionless, watching. He stamped the fire out with his coat, bare hands and breath that came sharp between his teeth. The flames hissed and died. Smoke lingered like a ghost. When it was done, he turned to her. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Her face held nothing, or maybe too much to show. He waited, eyes on her, breath slowing, but she gave no explanation. Not an accident, then. Or if it was the kind that comes from a place beneath reason, the kind that says, "I don't want rescue, I want release." He didn't ask. He just nodded once and walked away, smoke still clinging to his clothes like old grief. The next day, the town whispered. Someone had seen the preacher sprinting. Someone said smoke rose from the barn. Someone asked if he had a woman hiding out again. The same someone nodded knowingly, as if mercy had a pattern and suspicion was holy. At the chapel, no one asked directly, but their silence had new shapes, the kind that makes a man's skin itch, the kind that grows behind backs and under hats. The preacher gave his sermon that Sunday, eyes fixed on the pews, voice steady, hands still smelling faintly of smoke. She stayed in the barn. That night he found a piece of fabric nailed to the outside of the barn door, burned at the edges, the color long faded, but it had once been part of her dress, torn deliberately, pinned where all could see, or maybe just him. A message, but to whom? To him, that he hadn't saved her, only delayed something, or perhaps to herself, proof she could still destroy what once defined her. Perhaps both. He left it there. No one spoke of it. But he noticed, the following Sunday, the pew behind the choir stayed empty, and the widow who usually offered him bread after service looked at his hands before handing him the loaf. Women who return are not always welcomed, not when they come from barns, not when they come without explanations, not when they burn something, even if only fabric. He didn't defend her, he didn't justify her. He just placed the bread on the table, broke it in half, and left one piece on the crate outside the barn door. Some fires are not cries for help. Some fires are a way to say, "I'm still here," even if the smoke says otherwise. He arrived without warning. A man on a tall chestnut horse, dust on his coat, a badge at his belt. He rode into town like he belonged, like the road bent for him, the kind of man who didn't shout to be obeyed. He only spoke when everything else had gone quiet. He asked for the preacher. He asked if the woman was here. He didn't say her name at first, just said he had orders, a letter, a history, said she'd gone missing from somewhere back east, said there were legal concerns, said there were claims. Then, as if reading scripture, he said her name, but it wasn't her name anymore. It was something she had worn once, like a dress that never fit, like a name spoken only by those who broke her. The townsfolk looked up from their ledgers and their brooms, their glances heavy with speculation. The preacher met him outside the chapel. They stood under the shade of the old mesquite, the kind of tree that remembers every drought. The man handed over the letter, folded paper, official seal, words that meant property, obligation, ownership. She stood not far away, watching, still as winter water. She didn't run, didn't hide, just wouldn't meet his eyes. That said enough. The preacher read the letter, twice. His hand didn't tremble, but the air around him thickened, not with anger, not with fear, with memory, the kind that whispers, "She has survived enough." He looked at the man, then at the badge, then he spoke. "She left nothing behind but her name, and even that she doesn't want back." The man didn't argue. He wasn't cruel, just convinced. As if mercy were a luxury, as if the law could weigh a woman's silence and decide what it meant. The preacher stepped aside, gave no threat, just stood between her and the past. That night, she left a coin on the chapel step, old, worn smooth at the edges, enough to buy bread, or not, but its weight was different. It was repayment, not for rescue, but for standing still when it mattered most. He found it before morning, held it in his palm like a confession he hadn't asked for. The sheriff never came back, didn't knock, didn't write, just turned his horse and rode out without a word, not out of defeat, but recognition. Some debts aren't meant to be collected, some names are meant to be buried, and some women, the ones who burn their own dresses, who stay in barns longer than needed, who stare at letters without blinking, they get to decide what they are called now. He built it in silence. 2 pieces of pine, one old, one newly cut. He didn't measure much, just sat on the porch one morning and began. Sawdust gathered at his boots, the scent of wood thick in the morning air. No one asked why, no one watched. But the space beside his usual seat had stayed empty for weeks, and sometimes silence leaves a shape that needs filling. The chair was plain, strong, slightly uneven. He placed it next to his, just far enough to feel respectful, just close enough to be invitation. She didn't sit in it, not that day, not the next. She passed it every morning on her way to the well. She touched it once, brushed a leaf off the seat, but that was all. Still, he never moved it, never explained it, just let it wait, like he had. 3 weeks later, she sat, not during a meal, not at sunset, just one afternoon as the wind picked up and the dust began to rise. She walked up the steps and lowered herself into the chair like it was always hers. No words, no glance, and something in the world exhaled. After that, a rhythm returned, not like before. Before didn't exist anymore, but something close. Quiet mornings, the scraping of spoons, the murmur of chores, a mug passed without speech, a window cleaned without request, the way she hummed, off-key, almost breathless, while brushing the mare's mane. Healing didn't knock, it didn't announce itself. It came in small repetitions, in steady hands, mending a tear, in a blanket folded and left at his door when the nights grew cold. In the way she began to use his name, only when needed, never in front of others, as if claiming it too loudly might scare it away. He didn't ask her to stay. She never said she would. But one morning, he noticed her boots lined up beside his, and later, her shawl hung by the door. The barn was clean now, empty of ropes, full of hay, and she didn't sleep there anymore. They never spoke of vows. There were no rings, no ceremony. But when she handed him a cup of tea and he took it without looking, and she sat again in the chair that no longer creaked, that was the ritual. Some bruises fade, some stay, but in that house, bruises weren't questioned. They were seen, and slowly, her hands began to do what they hadn't done in years. They stitched, they gathered eggs, they braided a child's hair, they held the railing lightly as she stepped onto the porch each dawn, breathing in a day that no longer felt like punishment. No one called her by the old name, not even in whispers, and when the chair stayed empty for an hour or two, he didn't worry, because it always held her shape now, even when she wasn't there. The barn still stands, its roof now patched, its hinges replaced, its walls sealed from the wind. But every night before dusk pulls its last thread of color from the sky, she closes the door, not with force, not with fear, just quietly, as if to say, this chapter is finished, but never forgotten. Inside, on a high shelf she never dusts, there is a piece of rope. Not the whole thing, just enough to remember, just enough to prove that one day she stood up, not rescued, not carried, but on her own feet. She never speaks of it, never shows it, but she keeps it, not for pain, not for power, but for truth. The preacher still wears black, the same coat, the same boots, but now the color is worn down, not with mourning, with peace. The kind that doesn't shine, doesn't preach, doesn't try to fix the world, just stays. They speak less than people expect, but silence isn't absence. In that house, silence is comfort. It's the sound of water being poured, the rustle of pages turned at dusk, the soft thud of a broom against wood, and every now and then a low laugh, almost surprised to have escaped. Sometimes when thunder rolls in the distance, they both stop what they're doing. She will pause at the sink, fingers resting on a wet dish. He will freeze mid-step, eyes on the sky. They never explain it. They never say, I remember. But the breath they take together says everything. That not all storms are weather, that some live under skin and between ribs and behind the eyes, and still they stay. Not because the past is gone, not because pain is cured, but because there's enough peace now to make room for it. On the porch, 2 chairs, worn, unmoving. The wood shaped by time, by weight, by presence. Between them a candle, not bright, not steady, but lit, flickering not from wind. The night is still, but because it was always meant to. They don't hold hands, they don't need to, because some bonds, once tied, never need rope again.